Okay, I think I'm going to start, and then if people want to trickle in, you can trickle in. But hello, everyone. Welcome. We are so happy you're all here. So today we're basically going to talk about interview preparation for medical school. And today we are lucky to have 5 MS1s from UCLA to kind of talk about their experience on their interview trail. So basically the way that today is going to work is we're going to start off with some introductions, and then we're going to discuss questions in terms of preparing for the interviews, do's and don'ts, and then we're going to close with Q&A and any concluding remarks. For those of you here, if you want to ask a question, make sure you ask in the Zoom Q&A feature and not in the chat feature, please. And if you're not sure how to do that, just private chat me. And now for introductions. Hello, my name is Steffi. I'm an MS2 and I'll be moderating. And now we'll have the panelists introduce themselves, and we'll start off with Danielle. They can tell us their name, where they're from, and the undergrad that they came from.
Hey everyone, I'm Danielle. I'm from Colorado and I went to Princeton for my undergrad. And then, as Steffi said, I'm now an MS1 here at UCLA.
Thank you. Now we can go with Tara.
Hi everyone, I'm Tara. I did my undergrad at UC Davis. I'm originally from the Bay, and I'm also an MS1 now at DGSOM.
Great, thank you. All right, now we can go with Brian.
Hi everyone, my name is Brian. I'm an MS1 part of the CDU UCLA Medical Education Program, and I'm originally from Los Angeles. I was born and raised in the Valley, went to CSUN for undergrad, and then spent 3 years in Massachusetts, and happy to be back in LA.
And then we can go with Emula.
Hi everyone, my name is Amelia. I grew up in the Bay, South Bay, and I moved to Cleveland for school. I graduated from Case Western Reserve, and yeah, I'm here as an MS1 here at UCLA.
Great, and then Nikki.
Hi everyone, my name is Nikki. I graduated from USC and I'm from San Diego, and now I'm at UCLA.
Great, thank you. All right, so now we're going to start with the questions. This first portion is basically going to be like preparing for the interview. So the first question is, what are virtual interviews typically like? Like, what was your overall experience while you were interviewing virtually? Because everything was so different this year.
Okay, I'll start. I actually really enjoyed interviewing, which might seem kind of weird, but I felt like it was a lot more fun than secondaries to actually be able to talk to people. Because everything was online, some of my interviews split like the informational sessions on certain days of the week, and the actual interview portion was on a different day. And some schools like UCLA had it all as part of one really long day. So I think the actual format of the interview varies school to school. And also, there's the difference between like MMI interviews where you have different stations and different breakout rooms versus a traditional Q&A portion. So the interview days for me really varied, but again, I actually really enjoyed them. I thought they were pretty darn fun.
I like the positive twist on it. Nice. Would anyone else like to answer?
I have to say it was nice not to travel. I think that's one of the best things that came out of virtual interviewing. That being said, it was kind of hard to get to know sort of the school itself. I feel like once you visit, you're able to see what the school's like, what the people are like. But I think most schools try to do, like Tara said, like an informational part of it, whether it's the day of or a different day that can help. But that is one thing that I found to be kind of difficult. So I had to find sort of other ways to connect with current students or reach out to admissions to get all my questions answered for sure.
Yeah, it's a really good point. A lot of money saved, but at the same time, it's so difficult to, I guess, rate each school, right? Great point. And then Nikki, did you want to go?
Yeah, well, I think that for me, virtual interviews, as Tara said, was a plus. I think that being on your home turf allows you to get more comfortable. I still think it was important for me personally to give in to the nervous energy in order to make myself more alert. So I did dress up as if it was my full interview. I know that some people preferred wearing sweatpants and fuzzy socks and stuff, but I wear my whole interview get up and I treated it as if I was in person. But I do think that the comfort of being in your own space, you can treat it as an advantage. So I enjoyed my experience with virtual interviewing.
Great. If anyone else has anything they'd like to say, you can speak up, or I can move on to the next question. I'm going to move on. So I think this is a really good question. So how did everyone prepare for your interviews?
Yeah, so I did a variety of things. I mean, first I did some preparations just for like getting used to the virtual interview format itself. So I joined a Zoom meeting with just me, and then I would just like speak, and then I recorded myself, and then I would watch it back later and be like, am I fidgeting and I didn't notice it, or like, does it not actually look like I'm looking at the camera, or things like that. And that helped me troubleshoot like exactly how high I wanted my laptop to be, exactly where I wanted my chair to be, what my background needed to look like, and all that stuff. And then as far as the content of the interviews, so I don't know if UCLA has this, but my undergrad institution had like a forum where students would submit like interview feedback, and they would have like questions that they got asked on there. Otherwise, Student Doctor Network also has pages for each school's interviews where everyone will list the questions that they got asked there. So I like went through all of those and kind of wrote down the ones that I saw came up a lot, and I kind of just prepared a little like bullet point list for each question. And then I would spend a little bit of time just like practicing like what would happen if I got asked this question and what would I say. And I tried not to spend too much time on that. So if I did get asked, it wouldn't be rehearsed. But I tried to like kind of be comfortable with what I wanted to say. And then I also did the same thing for like the questions that are common across all schools, like why medicine, or, you know, tell me about yourself, or those questions like that, where it was likely they would come up. I also kind of prepared little rough answers to those. Yeah, that was the majority of my preparation. Oh, one other thing I also did, sorry, I would recommend this, is I came up with like a little, I think I called it a story bank for myself, which is just like a cohesive list of a lot of my experiences that I could draw from to answer various questions. And I just had to like think back through like, what were all my experiences? What are things that I like were very salient in different parts of my life that I have forgotten about since? And that also helped too, just to have in the back of my head. So if someone was like, oh, tell me about a time that you like had to give feedback, I could like try to think back, like, okay, what are some experiences that I've had where I might have had to do that? And so like kind of just cataloging different stories I could tell was helpful for me.
What helped for me was kind of going through the interview itself. So I asked a lot of my friends, especially some of my friends that are already in medical school, just to like hop on Zoom and then pretend everything is just like the real interview, except I didn't like dress up or anything, but we would go on Zoom. I would set my computer exactly the way that I would have it for like my actual interview. So I would like make sure that the camera's at eye level and I'm not looking down or looking up or anything, but that it's at eye level. And then I kind of went on Reddit and I just looked for like medical school interview questions, and I asked them to just ask me them and like to just go through like I would time us. I'd be like, all right, you know, this school has like 25-minute one-on-one interviews. So like we would set a timer for 25 minutes and I would just be like, ask me any one of these questions, and I would just kind of go through like an actual interview with them.
Yeah, I did very similar things as Brian and Danielle. Like Danielle's story bank, I had like a legal notepad that I wrote bullet points for like all my stories on. Another thing that I think is really important to do is to review your secondaries and your primary application, because anything that you do right in those is fair game to be asked. Brian and Danielle also brought up like SDN and Reddit, which can be super helpful. I feel like knowing how to use those resources can be really valuable, but if you're just scrolling mindlessly, I think some of that does contribute to like the anxiety and the stress of the interviews. And I wanted to add that for MMI interviews, I brushed up a little bit on medical ethics. There's a really good bioethics program at UW, And I think if you just Google like University of Washington ethics or something, their website will pop up. And just reading about like informed consent and autonomy, things like that can really help with your answers for those MMI questions to make sure that you're hitting like the key points that are important for you as a medical student and as a future physician who are going through these interviews.
Yeah, so something else that I did was I practiced with a couple of close friends. I also practiced with a pre-med advisor, so if you have access to that, that was really helpful for me. But practicing with the pre-med advisor allowed me to sort of tailor my answers to something that, like what he thought would be an effective content for my answers. And he was also able to tell me if I was saying too many times, or if my eye contact was like a little off, and things like that. And practicing with my friends gave me something different. I was able to see if like the content of my answers was like true and authentic to myself. And since my friends knew me best, they would be able to tell me if I had any like stress behaviors that were showing up, or if I had a better story that could have fit somewhere for a question. So that was helpful. If you have access to that, or if you have friends who are willing to help you, that could be super helpful. And then something else that I made sure to practice was what happens when I don't know the answer to a question, and to practice saying something like, that's a really great question, let me think about that for a second, or like, like, thank you for that question, I really appreciate it, I don't have an answer quite yet, but just give me a second, or something that's probably not so wordy. But if you can just practice what you're going to do in a super stressed moment, then it'll sort of come out a little nicer.
I think that now, with all of that being said, I think I did a little bit of what everyone did. So I think what Danielle mentioned, I had 3 things that I did. So if I had an interview the next day or a couple days from now, I would go over my primary and secondary application. I would go to the student doctor page and I would go through all of the questions and practice out loud. And the 3rd thing I would do is there's a website called Shemasian Academic Consulting or something to that degree. And they've compiled a list of the most common questions. So it would be like personality-based questions, like tell me about yourself. And then there was also MMI situations. And I went through all of those and practiced. And I think that helped me overall for all of my interviews. The reason I would still practice MMIs, even if it's just a general interview, is because in my interviews, even when it was a general interview, I would get surprised by MMI questions. Like at the end, they might just say, oh, I just want to see how you would react in this situation. So even if they don't explicitly say that they're going to do it, they might still do it. So I think it's good to be prepared for that case. But yeah, and I guess just practicing. I personally only practice with a few people because I think that if you practice with too many people, you're going to get too many different points of view, and then you're going to get confused. So just picking the few people that know you best and practicing with them multiple times is the way I went, at least.
I'm going to piggyback. Oh, sorry, Danielle.
Do you want to go? I'll go.
Yeah, I'm just going to piggyback off what Nikki said really quick. I think a strong interview is one that comes off as authentic, and practicing too much can accidentally make your answers seem rehearsed. And I know there was a question in the Q&A about having notes, and I was allowed to have notes for a couple of mine, but I opted not to because I know that even if I wasn't gonna read off my notes, I might accidentally like glance away at them, and that can detract from the more natural seeming aspects of your interview. So for me, it was important that I not do that.
And then one thing I just wanted to highlight that Tara said earlier was that like anything that you do right on your primary and secondary, they can ask about. And I actually feel like I would venture to say like 50% of the questions I asked were just like piggybacks off of things I wrote. They'd be like, oh, I saw you like worked at this clinic, tell me more about that. Or, oh, I saw you like worked with like underserved youth, like what was the most rewarding part of that? And so just being ready to talk about all of the experiences you've had in a coherent way, and kind of like what I did was I would be like, okay, what did I learn from this experience? What were the rewards? What were the challenges? So like I did that for each of the things I wrote, because they can ask that, and they probably will. And also just it's good to know, like, to remind yourself what you already said, so that if they ask you like, what was it like working at the clinic, you don't just repeat everything you already wrote in your secondary, because then you want your interview to add to your application.
One thing I would like to add to that is that so one of the feedbacks I got from a lot of my friends is that, oh, like, don't talk about exactly like what you did day to day. Talk more about the experiences, like why that was important, what you learned from it, and how you want to apply it as a physician. Because anybody can do the day-to-day things, but to really think critically about it and kind of go back to it and see how you've grown from that experience, I think is more important.
I also just wanted to say that we all hear all sorts of advice. And so actually the advice that I heard is that it's okay if your interview questions, or sorry, your interview answers are very similar to what you put in your primary and secondary application, because it shows that it's consistent. I think something else to be aware of is that it's not always the same people who are interviewing you who have read and evaluated your primary and secondary applications. If it's like an open application interview, they might have read it, but they might not be the people who are evaluating or who got you that interview, if that makes sense. They all can be different people from the admissions committee. So it's not bad to restate something that was important to you. If that was really the main takeaway, you don't have to be too creative in finding something else. But like Danielle said, you do want your interview to add to your application. And the best way that I think that you can do that is by making sure that every answer you give points back to fit. How will you fit in at the school, and why is the school a good fit for you? And if you can sprinkle that answer into every conversation you have, I think that's going to make for a really strong interview. I always say that going on an interview, going to a med school interview is like going on a date where you already know that the other person likes you. So they already read your primary and your secondary applications. They have seen your work and activities section. They like the material you're bringing. When you're coming to an interview, they already like you. They just want to know, is this person in person the same person that I've read from the application? And can I see this person? Can I envision this person attending my school? So if you can give them that answer, it's going to make for a strong interview.
Well, everyone had great points. Thank you all for sharing. So we kind of touched on this, but just to take a deeper dive, do any of you have any tips in reducing stress before and during the interview? And did this get better as the cycle progressed?
So I just called a friend. Oh, sorry. I keep doing this. Sorry, Brian. I just called a friend before my first interview. I think the first one is really the most anxiety provoking because it's totally unknown territory. You don't know what you're getting into. And naturally for me, they just became kind of more normalized, I guess. And so it became easier and easier, but definitely deep breathing. And oh God, what's that thing called? When you visualization, kind of visualize yourself at the school, I guess, pump yourself up, put yourself in a good mood, because really they just want to see that you're a normal person, and that if you're a student, you'll get along with the other students and you'll get along with the faculty, and just that you're a cool, normal person.
So I don't really have any tips for the night before, because I feel like the night before every interview I was a giant mess. But I do have tips for when you're in the interview, is that whenever you guys have a break or anything, just turn off your camera and just take some deep breath, breathe in, breathe out. That will help calm you down a lot. That's what helped me, is just breathe in, breathe out. You made it here, you made it this far, you're doing great. Just keep going. It'll be over soon. And then you'll be a medical student. So yeah, that's my tip.
Yeah, to Brian's point, I'm sorry. To Brian's point, the only way to fail an interview answer is if you're so tied up in it that you're not able to move forward. As long as you just take a deep breath and give an answer, you've answered the question, and it's going to be great. So the only that really helped me is like anytime that I felt like I was choking in the middle of an interview, I just, took a deep breath and said, okay, let's just say the next sentence and then it'll be fine.
Well, thank you all for that. Those are great points and great things to use during the interview. The next question that we have is, should you prepare your answers for common questions ahead of time or think on the fly? What do y'all all think?
I definitely think common questions you should prepare ahead of time. Like I would even like I said earlier when I was doing like my interview preps, like I made sure I verbalized it because something you like type down or write down, it'll never come off the same when you say it in person. And you got to say it a couple of times to like really figure out how you want to say it. Because yeah, like my why medicine, like I knew all the components of why medicine, but it never flew like properly until like my fifth or sixth time actually saying it out loud.
I think for me, the two big ones that I got asked at every single interview were tell me about yourself and why medicine. So those ones I did definitely prepare for beforehand. And I think it's important, like I think that sure you could like prepare and sound over prepared like you're reading off a script, but I think you can also prepare and practice sounding natural when you're telling the story. So that's what I worked on. Was first I got the content down and then I figured out how to say it in a way where I could break it up and like laugh and act like I just came up with it on the spot. Also, again, going back to that list of questions, I'll try to post it on the document Steffi seems to have with resources from Shamasian Consulting. I would go through all the questions that were very common, and then I figured out stories that kind of fit many of the questions. And I think I had like 3 stories that I practiced a lot and I could mold into the question that was being asked. So if the question was more clinically focused, I had a story for that for clinically focused situations. Or if it was more philanthropy focused, I had a story in my back pocket for that I did practice. So you don't have to practice every single question, but you need to practice a few core things that you can use a lot.
All right, great. Thank you so much for sharing. All right, so the next question, I know you guys mentioned like why medicine, but what other questions were pretty common throughout your interview trail besides why medicine, which is a question that they usually ask as well?
I think the biggest one that every school asks you is why do you want to come to like this school specifically? Like, what is it about our program that makes you want to go? So I would say at least like the week before your interview, you should probably Google what their mission statement is, like maybe something about the curriculum, something about the faculty there that you could be like, oh, I really love this school because you guys have like a curriculum that does this, and that. And then it pretty much shows that you're just interested in their program specifically.
One thing I did like to help with that is I reached out to alumni from like my undergrad who attended that med school. I hope that that's like a network that you guys can take advantage of here, but so they would like Princeton connected me to like current med students or people who were alumni of the med school. And so then I would call them, I would just like set up a phone call with them, and then I would have them talk to me about the school. And what they would do is give me like a really like mostly unintentionally, but they'd give me a really good idea of like what the school is known for and what kinds of things the students value there. And so, for example, like when I when I was calling people at DGSOM, like a lot of them highlighted the fact that we have like a really diverse set of clinical sites that you can rotate at. And a lot of them highlighted like the student run homeless clinic or opportunities for advocacy, or they highlighted things about LA that made it a really great place to learn medicine in. And so then when I was formulating my like why DGSOM answer, I would pull things from there. So it helped me, it helped give me things to pull from and like really kind of understand a school from the student perspective, which is obviously like what you want to point to as you're answering, like why you want to go to that school, because you will be a student. Other common questions, like I said, tell me about yourself, just as like the first question they ask was common for me. And just kind of, you have to figure out like what exactly you want to say and how you want to wrap up your intro in like a short 2-minute period that kind of covers a lot. And then, like I said, the questions where they're like, oh, tell me more about this experience, or what was it like
with this experience, etc. I also think I got a lot of tell me about a time you were stressed, or tell me about a time you failed, or like those kinds of answers. So I'd be prepared for that. I also got like some resume specific questions. So I think Danielle pointed to that earlier where they like bounced off of her application. I've also seen that they can ask if you have a deficiency in your application, they might straight up ask you about it. So be prepared to explain if you got like a poor grade at one point, or if you got, you know, if, yeah, you know the deficiencies in your application. So just be prepared to explain those. I got things like, what's your proudest non-academic achievement and why? So I think the resource that Nikki will post will probably cover a lot of those ones. And then for MMI questions and also non-MMI, I got a lot of like healthcare questions. So what's your opinion of the ACA? What role will AI play in medicine? And things like that. And for those questions, I think it's important to remember that you're not expected to know the answer yet. You're not a medical student yet. What they're looking for in those kinds of questions is, do you have like some critical thinking skills that you can display here? And are you able to talk about a potentially controversial topic and be level-headed and give both sides, and also be able to make a decision and provide like an argumentative answer, and not like say that both sides may be true. Just be like, this is what just give an actual opinion that's an argument, and don't fence it. If it's not a topic that you're super familiar with, you can make that clear and you won't be penalized for not knowing. But you should know enough to be able to at least engage with the question, even if you're not super familiar. So like, for example, if you don't know a ton about AI, but you get that question, at least be prepared to talk about the role of technology in medicine, and then be prepared to answer follow-up questions when they give you them. Yeah, hope that helps.
Another question that I got a lot as a California applicant applying to a lot of East Coast schools was like, what type of support system will I have on the East Coast? Why? Like, what will I do to make sure that I have the resources I need to take care of my own well-being? That was one that I got a lot, and I didn't super prepare for it. I didn't know that it was something that people would ask, but it came up a lot. I want to piggyback also of what Amelia said. And for the healthcare questions, for me, they came a lot of times in context of COVID. And so the question I got again and again was like, given the pandemic, what do you think is the most pressing shortcoming of our healthcare system? And my answer for that was always accessibility. And I found a way to tie it into the current socio-political climate without necessarily taking a side. I think being able to discuss sensitive topics shows a lot of maturity. And so if you can do that appropriately, I think it will reflect very strongly on you.
Great. Well, thank you guys for answering those as well. Another question. So what are the logistical things that you should consider when you're setting up virtual interviews? For example, like a certain Zoom background, certain lighting, what to wear and such. What were things that you guys implemented?
So I feel like there's a place to stand out and there's a place to not stand out. And for me, I felt like my dress and my background were not where I wanted to stand out. So I had a plain background. I know some people said that they put like paintings or stuff in the background as conversation starters, but I didn't have anything like that at my disposal. So I went with a plain background, and I dressed in like a proper business formal pantsuit. I can't remember who it was, either Danielle or Nikki said that they did their whole interview get up. And I agree, I did the same thing. I actually had one interview that told me to wear professional pants because they might ask me to stand up, and they never did. But I even put on like business shoes just in case I would have to show my feet, which I thought was kind of weird. But yeah, and I see that someone asked in the RSVP form about putting the virtual background of the school that you're interviewing at. And I personally didn't, just because I thought maybe that was a little bit premature because, you know, you don't really go there yet, but that's just my take. I think for me, I erred on the side of being more conservative. And one of my school advisors actually told me that being from California, there might be this prejudice or this bias that Californians are like super casual. So she advised me to just be as professional as possible in that context. And that's what I stuck with.
I've got a couple of tips. For me, I think like things like camera angle, I think are super important. If that means like purchasing a camera attachment for your computer and like putting it on top so that you can be more eye level. I think someone mentioned eye level earlier. I think that just makes you look more confident. It puts you in a better light. It's these small things. You have no other way than these like small things like faking eye contact by looking at the camera and stuff like that to show that you're super engaged and have all these nonverbal cues for how you're engaging with the conversation. Whereas in person, you could do, you know, your posture, your body language, all those things could be communicating, but that's so hard to see on a virtual setting. So as best as you can, I would recommend to replicate some of those things. So I had my laptop elevated and then my camera is on top of my laptop. So it's at a really nice angle. I put a light behind my computer to illuminate my face and to get good lighting for me. Like Tara, I had a plain background. I wanted the focus of my little Zoom box to be on me as opposed to anything in the background, just because it's so small that I didn't think it would really make a difference. I would recommend either using like a neutral background or a virtual background of your own choice that's also plain. Whether or not it's the school that you're applying to, I think like you can make that decision. But I thought virtual backgrounds were a sign of professionalism and just like normalize the use of virtual backgrounds since not everybody necessarily has access to just a plain wall. And if you know, they didn't want to show what their home looks like, everybody would be using virtual backgrounds. So I thought it looked professional for me also to use a virtual background. And then I did a lot of things with my Zoom settings to make it seem like I was making eye contact. So I hid my self view. If you're like me, you have a tendency to look at yourself when you're talking on a Zoom, and that can be really distracting and can look a little bit off. Like if you're not looking at the camera, I think they can tell. Not that it's an issue. I mean, you can be looking away from the camera and still look sort of engaged, but I wanted to really replicate it as best as I could. So I hid my self view and I pulled the screen as close to the top of my my laptop as I could, so that if I could like look directly into the camera and still see what was happening on my Zoom screen. And yeah, those are some of the basic things that I did.
Yeah, I did the same thing as Amelia, where I kept my self view because I like to look at myself when I'm talking to see like, am I fidgeting or like, does my hair look weird or whatever. But it's just up to you and like what works for you. And then I did the same thing where I shrunk the Zoom screen so it was like literally this big, and then I pushed it to as close to the top of my screen as I could get it. So that way it like when I was looking at myself, it really did look like I was looking at the camera, because it was so hard for me to talk to like my like camera, because I was like, I feel like I'm just talking to a robot. So I liked it better to where I could like look at my interviewer and look at me and talk, but it would still look like I was making good eye contact. And that's important because it's easy to forget that like when you're looking, and even like during the rest of the sessions, like I would pin the people who were talking to the top or move them manually, because even if you just like are watching the dean's presentation on the curriculum, but it looks like you're looking down, but really you're just like looking at them talking, but they're at the bottom of your screen, you know, like they might look over and see and be like, oh, Danielle's completely unengaged while we're talking about our curriculum. She must not care. And like, you're like, no, it was just the bottom of my screen. So, you know, you want to make sure that you look engaged the whole time. So I would always just make sure I was always looking at the top. And then as far as other tips, yeah, I elevated my computer so that it was more at eye level, and I made sure I was like taking up an appropriate amount of space on the like Zoom square, you know, not too close, not too far. I remember just like seeing other interviewees and being like, they're so far away from the camera, like you can hardly see them, or being like, oh, they're so close, like just their face, and like that's a little aggressive, you know. So find the right balance. And then yeah, I used a ring light too, because my old apartment lighting was like pretty orange and kind of dim. And then another thing I would just advise you of is to make sure you have no distractions. Like tell your roommates to leave the room, kick all your pets out, all of the devices on do not disturb. Make sure there's like nothing that can distract you, because it's so hard to give a good answer and be distracted. And it's also super unprofessional to have noise in the background or anything like that. So make sure that you have no distractions. I was in an interview and I like kicked my cat out of the room, but she was like banging at the door and it was so distracting. I was like just trying to focus, but she's like banging at the door. And I was like, I don't even know what I said for that question because I was so distracted. So, and then I was going to say one last thing and I forgot. So it probably wasn't that important.
One thing I do want to say, talking to a lot of professors, is that they understand that like your whole life is going on in the background, that you're not like at the school, and like it's okay if I remember in one of my interviews, a girl had a cat in her background the whole time, running around, jumping around, doing her thing, and like it's fine. Like they understand, and like if something happens, you could like just verbalize like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. My cat just, knocked my coffee over my computer. And they're gonna be like, yeah, like they have kids or whatever. They're gonna be like, yeah, my kid does the same thing when I'm on Zoom. So like if things happen, like don't just try to ignore it. I wouldn't try to ignore it. I like acknowledge it, like, oh, I'm so sorry. Like, cause I used to live on a major highway and there was just trucks and all this stuff honking and stuff. And then if there was one truck that like the guy just wanted to honk real loud, I would be like, I'm so sorry. Like they're honking, and then I just let the honk stop, and then I continue. And yeah, none of my interviews started as a problem. Like they get it. So remember, they're people too.
Great, thank you, everyone. So for my next question, is there anything you wish you had done differently? And what are common mistakes that you think that future med students should avoid during the interview trail?
One thing I wish I prioritized more or like thought about more was just being more myself and being more like, I don't know, I don't want to say like energetic, but just like being more like outgoing and friendly throughout the entire interview day. Like there was like a moment of silence in one of my interviews. There's just like all students and I think like one or two faculty, and they were just, it was like a just transition period. So I was just like, hey, how's everyone doing? Or, like I saw someone, was from a certain place and I'd be like, oh, are you from Florida? Like that's cool. Or, it's just trying to like make conversation. Normally in like an in-person interview, sometimes like the faculty will pick up on that and be like, oh, this student was like really making conversation with all the other students in the lobby. And sometimes those nuances they'll actually like comment on when they're discussing you as an applicant. But obviously over Zoom, it's harder, but I think there are still ways to show that like you'd be a good peer. And so just, be mindful of that, like throughout the whole day, like not just during your interview block, that you are like showing that you'd be a good peer, that you're being respectful of other people and engaged in listening to them and not just like checked out until it's your interview time. So I kind of just wish I thought about that more as I was going along the interview trail. And then even just when answering questions, like just being myself. And like, if I had a question I wanted to ask the interviewer, like, even though I might not have, it wasn't like the designated time to ask questions, I'd still just like make it a conversation because that's who I am. And that's like what I would do if this was a conversation. And so I think that goes a long way to show that you're genuine and human and would be like a good person to have around campus.
So what I would do different, I don't know if this is possible, and I don't know if they're actually still even doing this, but with regards to those, I think they're like asynchronous interviews is what they're called, like Vita. And I know Casper came out with something. I think if it's possible, I would try to practice those. I don't know how, maybe just like recording yourself and playing it back and like looking at how you look and what you're saying. I think that was a new aspect that came into play when we were doing interviews, and like it was brand new. It was super fresh and no one really had a lot of input and advice on how to do them. And they really caught me off guard. I don't necessarily have any advice besides see if there's a way to practice them, but if I could go back, I would try to do something to prep for those. And I also want to add to Danielle's point, if they ever ask, like, do you have any questions? I would always ask at least 1 or 2 questions just to show that I'm engaged. And if I couldn't think of anything, my fail-safe was always, is there anything about this program that you wish more applicants would know about? And most of my interviewers would get super excited and they would perk up at that question, and it would help form like a conversation after the question and answer portion of the interview would end. And I think that that goes a long way to showing that you, again, like you're a normal, personable person who can fit in at their school.
Great, thank you. Before we move on, so I want to give everyone attending the meeting an opportunity to ask any questions that you'd like in the Q&A function. I did want to leave some time for that. If not, I have some questions from the RSVP form that I can read off. So I'll start with the first question off the RSVP form, but anytime that y'all have any questions off the Q&A, I can read that one off as well, just to make sure we answer all of your questions. So one question that we received was how to directly answer questions about weaknesses like low grades, or I guess any discrepancies in your application, if anyone has any input on that.
Typically with questions like these, including like, what do you think is your greatest weakness? Or tell me about a time that you failed, anything that might put you in a negative light. Number one, like just answer it like head on, first of all. Like just acknowledge that it might have been a deficiency and that it was bad. You don't need to play it off like it was something great that happened. But then genuinely explain the circumstances. If there was circumstances surrounding why that happened, be frank about them. I wouldn't like hold back as to any circumstances that you know, maybe made you fail in that instance. I've definitely had people worry that they were making excuses or things like that, but just be frank about the circumstances that caused it, while also acknowledging your own agency and like why something may have gone poorly. And then always end one of these answers with either how you improved in that moment or like directly after that moment and how you're doing better now, or how you're currently working on being better. You know, if someone asks you your greatest weakness, you can talk about something and then talk about how you're working on it so that it will no longer be a weakness for you in the future. Specifically about weaknesses, if they're asking you about like a personal weakness, definitely don't choose any weakness to disclose that would make you a bad fit for medicine or for medical school. Like don't say that you struggle with like empathy. Like don't say things like that. Pick a weakness that is not going to ruin you as an applicant. So it's like sort of tangential, and then something that you're definitely doing to become better. So like, for example, like you might say like, I'm not super comfortable with new technology and I struggle to acclimate with new technology. So I'm currently working on that by taking computer science courses so that I can become better at so that can no longer be a weakness for me or something like that. That's a much better answer than like, I struggle to empathize with other people, because that's sort of like the core thing. I covered a lot of ground there. Sorry, I hope that was helpful.
Great, thank you. That was great. So another question that we got from the RSVP form is, how long should the why medicine question be?
I think I was told like 3 minutes. You don't want it to be too short. I think the minutes go by very fast when you're talking, but if you're stumbling simultaneously, it goes by very slow. And it's okay to take pauses, like try to get comfortable with the silence. It'll feel like a long time to you, but it probably isn't to the listener. And pauses go a long way for helping you recollect your thoughts and also framing your answer in a way that shows that you're thoughtful and you're not just like verbal vomiting all over your interviewer. So I think 3 minutes is what I was told. And something that I learned in debating is that having 3 key points, there's like some science behind it that people remember things in threes, I think. So for those answers, I would have like 3 reasons for why medicine, or like for tell me about yourself, I would try to hit 3 major points. And same with for why this school, I would come up with 3 again.
I think for why medicine for me as well, I like what Tara said. I actually did the 3 points as well, but mine was more like story form. So like 3 events in my life. And I think that what worked for me was I made it where it was around 3 minutes, but I made it more like a conversation. So I practice, especially if you're on a virtual environment, you lose the nonverbal cues, like the body language that conveys so much meaning when you're in person. So I think voice inflection is really important. So just being like, and then this happened, and like, or, you know, like just having like kind of an energetic voice, or like pausing at things that are supposed to be really shocking or volatile, and getting the person invested in your storytelling, I think is very important, especially for when you're talking for 3 minutes, because I think it's easy for someone to just get bored. So yeah, that's what I did.
Great, thank you. Another question, which I actually had this question when I was on my interview trail. How do you create questions for the end of the interview? Was there like a set of questions that you went in with? Did you just think of them on the fly? Should you even ask questions at the end of the interview? What are your guys' thoughts?
I say always ask questions at the end of the interview, unless for some reason you're told explicitly not to. Most interviews will have like space for you to do so, and it always looks like you're a more engaged applicant if you have questions. You can have some like what I call like first level questions. Like you can ask like, what does the curriculum look like, or like these things, but you can, but I would really steer away from things like that. You know, don't ask questions that you can find the answers to on the website. I think it makes you look unprepared. And I would much rather recommend asking like higher level questions. You know, what do the faculty think about a certain aspect, or what do students love most about, or what do students maybe struggle with that you have advice for? So I think those higher level questions are a lot more interesting and show that you're prepared, and can show your preparedness by asking about specifics.
If you have a student interviewer, you can also ask them questions about what it's like living in that city, where they live, if they have a car, you know, things that might be basic, but that you can really only find out from a student who lives there. And I would also, so I'm a very chatty person in person. I really like talking, and my interviews, almost all of them went over the allotted amount of time. And I feel very passionately about asking questions at the end. I think it's a must. So I would always just ask, I would say something like, I know we ran a little bit over time. Do you have a few minutes for me to ask you just a couple quick questions, so that, you know, like if they had to go somewhere, I was giving them an out, but also I did want to know the answers to my questions. So I would kind of finesse.
This might be too like niche, but one type of question I would try to ask like once was like a question that sort of makes them defend yourself to you, if that makes sense. So like, for example, I'd never been to LA before moving here a week ago. And so, you know, I recognize that probably a concern the school might have is like, can this person feel comfortable? Like, does this person have a support network? Like, how could they contribute to a city that they don't even know, kind of thing? So what I asked my interviewer was like, hey, you know, I'm like, I really want to participate in like a lot of like advocacy and health equity outreach programs like while I'm at LA, but like I'm new to the city. So like, do you think that someone who's new to LA can like effectively engage in these types of things? And then it literally made my interviewer like on the other side tell me why like I could thrive there. So like I said, might be too niche, but I think it like demonstrated that I recognize like a potential problem that they might see in me, or like a potential weakness for my fit. And then I like kind of ask them to defend why it might not be as bad as they might think. So see if you can maybe work it in, maybe not. if not, it's not like something you have to do, but just something I thought that might have been effective, and so I wanted to share.
Great. Another question that we received was, what are the best resources to use to prepare for the interviews? And then just for everyone here, so the link that I sent in the chat will have some of the resources that we talked about today. And I know we mentioned some, but do y'all have any extra resources you wanted to add?
I'll try to find a link to the UW ethics page and put it on there.
Great. And then the final question that we got on the RSVP form was, how much of health policy did you need to know for the interview?
So I only had one MMI, but I did not need to know any health policy or healthcare. I think, like Tara said, like knowing a little bit about medical ethics, or kind of having a little bit of an understanding of like when they show you like a video of like a bad healthcare interaction, like what kinds of things might you want to point out to be like, that wasn't okay. But I don't think you need to have any like intrinsic, I wouldn't say that. I personally did not need to have any intrinsic knowledge about like the Affordable Care Act or things like that. I don't know if that's true of all schools. And like I said, I did only have one MMI, so I don't know, but that's just my personal experience.
I think for me, I did do reading on what Medicare was, Medicaid was, the US healthcare system. And I found that very helpful for my interviews, because even if they didn't explicitly ask me about healthcare policy, I was able to incorporate in my answer to other questions. I felt like my answers became more substantive, because I was able to say, well, this is how the system is working right now, and this is what I think for it. And I think it made me seem more like I'm really interested in healthcare as a field. Even like knowing a few statistics that are alarming or whatever makes you seem, in my opinion, more knowledgeable. And I do think that I did get good, that was taken with like good feedback when I did it. So you don't have to spend too much time on it, but I think having an understanding or watching a few explanations on YouTube about how the US healthcare system works, and maybe how in comparison socialized medicine works, would be useful to know.
Yeah, so I wasn't asked about any like specific health policies, but what I was asked a lot about was like social determinants of health, and what are some structural determinants of health, and how those play a role in health in the community. So I would definitely kind of search that stuff up if you don't know it, because I feel like I was asked that a lot.
I, first of all, want to emphasize social determinants of health. It's so important. Everybody should know about it. Don't go to an interview without being able to speak to that. I was somewhere in between Danielle and Nikki. I had a lot of MMIs for my interviews, but I did not know very much about health policy or our current healthcare system. I had one statistic at the time that I read off of a website that I no longer remember. I think it was just about how many people are uninsured. And when asked, I think the one thing that I knew about healthcare policy is that the status of your health insurance is a lot of times tied to your employer status. And so being unemployed, unfortunately, equates to being uninsured, which I think is a major flaw. And so that was the one thing that I was prepared to speak upon. And one thing that I want to add is I had interviews for schools in a bunch of different states, and every state has different policies. And with my MMIs, the thing that came up a lot was questions about consent and what do you do in these like random obscure situations when patients have issues with their consent. And so I would look up the age for like teens and children and the age of like reproductive consent and things like that, because that's like a handy tidbit that you can pull on in your interview, and it'll show that you not only did your research, but that you care enough to learn more about the school and the state and their system as a whole.
I think that the advice that everybody else gave is fantastic. I just want to speak to something kind of adjacent, which is that these questions about health policy are not meant to test your knowledge, they're meant to test your critical thinking skills. And they're meant to stress you out and figure out how you perform in a stressed out state. So they're supposed to sort of point out a gap in your knowledge. And if you don't have that gap in your knowledge, then great, you're going to do fantastic with the question. But they're meant to sort of get at this gap in your knowledge and figure out how you're going to, use your critical thinking skills to still engage with the question and still respond well. So if, in after all of your fantastic research on bioethics and socialized medicine and social determinants of health, if you still get a question that you don't know the answer to or are having difficulty formulating a response to, just take a breath, slow it down, and reframe the question in a way that makes sense to you and be clear. It's okay to admit that you don't know something. It's okay to say, oh, I'm not familiar with that type of healthcare structure, or I don't know that much about AI, or I'm not familiar with whatever you're just talking about. But this is my understanding of your question, and this is what I'm going to answer. That's another form of like this closed loop communication, where they ask you a question and you repeat the answer, you repeat the question back to them so that you're on the same page about what you're answering. And that's another, strength to show in your interview. So don't be worried, essentially, is my final thought. Don't be worried if you get a question that you're not super familiar with or that you don't know the answer to. It's still going to be okay. They're not testing you on the knowledge.
Great, thank you. So we have 1 minute until 8 o'clock. So if anyone wants to give any final remarks, I'll give you all the space to do that, and then we can end the meeting.
One last tidbit I'll give about interviewing is that I think one of the best pieces of advice I got beforehand was to take notes during your interview day and write down the vibe of the other students interviewing, the vibe of the faculty, the admin, how you liked the interview day, how it was structured. Was it well organized? Was it did they have a lot of breaks for you, or were they really just cramming things in? And then also just the content, write about the curriculum and whatever else, write about the questions you asked. Because it was the biggest thing I looked back onto when I was deciding which schools to go to. I went back through all my interview notes and also remembered, I'm I really loved the doctor who talked about global health, or I really loved this, or here were the things that they emphasized on interview day that were important to them, and those are also important to me. And so and when you have hopefully you'll be fortunate enough to have a lot of interviews to where you forget all of them and they get all muddled in your own head, and then you forget which schools you liked. And so that was one of the biggest pieces of advice I got and found it to be really helpful for me.
And that also is a good foundation for your thank you notes, which you should send by email. Don't worry about snail mail.
My advice is very unrelated, but if they give you breaks, please take them. My longest interview was actually UCLA, and they gave these optional breaks, and I didn't take the first one, and the second one came super late, and I was hungry, and it was around lunchtime. And in my head, I was planning out when I would eat my lunch. And so if they give you breaks, just take them, get up and stretch, empty your brain as much as you can, and really take those breaks.
Great, thank you all so much, and thank you everyone for attending. Again, the link in the chat is page 3 will have the resources that we talked about. And thank you to the panelists for coming out. I hope everyone has a great night. So thank you.